Hello, I'm John Griff. I've come to the research facilities of University College in London to find out more about lupus. Now, this all started a while ago when Rob Jewson, who is himself a lupus patient, came onto my radio programme to tell me about the help group that he helps to run in our home county of Northamptonshire.
Lupus is a disease of the immune system. Now, the immune system is a highly sophisticated network of cells that are found in the blood, usually the white blood cells, and also in the lymphatic tissues. And these cells are there to defend us because every time we breathe and eat and drink, millions, literally millions of viruses and bacteria pouring into our body. And the immune system acts like a sort of radar. It kind of spots the invader. And it's very good at distinguishing the foreign forces. Physical patterns, for example, is a young woman who goes outside on a hot day, is exposed to a lot of sunlight, and will develop a rash, often on her face and often in the shape of a butterfly. Often on her face and often in the shape of a butterfly. That's one of the classic ways in which lupus can present. But it can also present with joint pains, which can mimic rheumatoid arthritis. I've seen a number of patients treated. One of the classic ways in which lupus can present. But it can also present with joint pains, which can mimic rheumatoid arthritis. So I've seen a number of patients treated as if they had rheumatoid arthritis all along, when in fact they had lupus. Present with platelet problems. Now, the platelets are the cells in the blood which cause the blood to clot. So if the platelets are attacked in error, then this means diagnosis of lupus.
Is that why it can take a long time and a clear one to actually emerge?
Yes, because officially lupus can't be diagnosed sometimes. So you could, for example, have a light sensitivity.
For a diagnosis and a clear one to actually emerge?
Yes, because officially lupus can't be diagnosed until at least 4 of the criteria defined by the American College of Rheumatology have been met, and that may be some time. So you could, for example, have a light sensitivity for a number of years before the joint pains become obvious and the blood test abnormalities become obvious. And in fact, we know from some very interesting work done in American Army
that for people for quite some time before they get that clear diagnosis. From that point, what is the treatment phase and what are the processes involved?
Well, you're right that there can be a time. So let's say I saw a patient in the clinic who has an identical twins. So let's say I saw a patient in the clinic who has an identical twin. My patient's got lupus, and she asked me what is the chance that her sister, the
lupus right now?
Well, many lupus patients ask us what they can do to help themselves. And there are 2 or 3 things which I think are very important. Number 1, ultraviolet radiation is clearly something of an enemy for many lupus patients, not necessarily all of them, but for many of them. So patients with lupus are strongly advised to avoid going on holidays to Ibiza in the middle of July, for example. Now, I'm not saying that they should necessarily spend their holidays in Greenland in December, but nevertheless they've got to be careful. And strong high factor protective skin.
Here with some fantastic research facilities. Here with some fantastic research facilities. Research comes at a
competition is much fiercer, but there's also a lot of collaborative work which goes on. So I like to think that this combination of collaboration where that makes sense, and so it makes sense for the patient in the context of clinical trials work, for example, together with good basic science, which has been supported by adequate funding, makes for a very good combination of clinical and basic research.
After a very badly...
The answer is pretty serendipitous, really. Somebody somewhere said, well, this works for rheumatoid, this works for cancer. You know, we have nothing to lose. Let's give it to some patients with lupus, and we'll see if it works. But now we've moved from this era of serendipity, a good chance of preventing these B cells from making the antibodies which cause the trouble.
And if we're to avoid the word cure, is there any likelihood that perhaps stem cell research could help people with lupus from a genetic perspective?
Well, stem cells and stem cell research have already been applied to patients with lupus. The stem cell transplantation has been tried in a few very research-minded centres with some significant success, but not as complete a success as one perhaps might have hoped. But of course, the dice are slightly loaded against those kinds of trials because they're only given or it's only tried in patients for whom everything else has failed. So it's hard to see a picture across the whole spectrum of lupus patients when you're just looking at a very, very small number of patients very sick. So it's a little hard to say whether this can be more generalised at the moment. Showing that if you use much lower doses than we used all those years ago.
What the future might hold for them, other than to talk through some of the problems that they've already had in the light of
being diagnosed with lupus, and by extension, I suppose, their families as well, because it's not just the person with the diagnosis that has to live with the condition.
I think education is really important, but of course it's got to be at the right level for that person. So to some extent you have to try and judge that when you see somebody in a clinic setting. We certainly give him...
And the blood test abnormalities become obvious. And in fact, we know from some very interesting work done in American Army recruits that blood test abnormalities of lupus can be... They do need to take adequate rest. That is important.
Cost. Are you getting good value for money based on what is available to you as a research scientist?
Well, if I can answer the question in a slightly different way, what I would like to say is that we make very good use of the funds that we are able to obtain, which are obtained usually in the heat of fierce competition, I should add. It's not easy to get research funds, and I wouldn't say they've dried up, but it's certainly the competition is much fiercer. But there's also a lot of collaborative work which goes on. So I like to think that this combination of collaboration where that makes sense, and certainly makes sense for the patient in the context of clinical trials work, for example, together with good basic science, which has been supported by adequate funding, makes for a very good combination of clinical and basic research. And cyclophosphamide, which came in the 60s, the answer is it was all pretty serendipitous, really. Somebody somewhere said, well, look, this works for rheumatoid, this works for cancer, we have nothing to lose, let's give it to some patients with lupus, and we'll see if it works. But now we've moved from this era of serendipity to one of what I call immunologic sense, because we go for the molecules and cells which are actually likely to be causing the disease.
As a scientist, do you feel an imperative that your research work needs to be available on the high street in the form of medication or drugs or treatment at the earliest opportunity? There must be a long lead time before medical and research breakthroughs can actually make a difference to the lives of lupus patients.
Look, it's certainly true that even if I had an absolutely brilliant idea today, it would probably be 10 years plus before I would see that proven in a clinical trial. There is a time lag. But I think even that time lag has come down somewhat over the last 20 years. Clinical trials showing that if you use much lower doses than we used all those years ago, actually it's quite an effective drug. So in some senses there's a certain hopeful that in the course of the next decade we'll continue to see some major advances in the treatment of this disease. Not using the cure word, but I think patients will definitely benefit as a consequence of the work we've been doing.
David, we're very grateful to you for your time. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Automatic variable, see? Play the okay.
What about Chloe? One more. Half? Awful.
I threw it 4. I 3. Yeah. Look at that end though.
I don't know.
So I have to already have to stop.
Yeah.
That's nice, yeah. Not very brown.
Golden color.
Yeah.
At last,
Yeah.
finally.
Golden.
Little rest for the time.
Oh, eat it like a taco. You eat it, right?
No. It's
Full?
full. Yeah.
No, you
No,
couldn't.
she doesn't want it.
No?
Is that it? Have we made this chicken in there?
Everybody for
Yes. So
I
Yeah.
think my thing is
in
just
the
big.
big way.
yeah.
Hey, sit down.
No.
Remember when I did that thing about the writer?
Kain mana?
No, that's already sugar on it. Chloe, you want with sugar?
Đi kiếm
Yeah,
phòng
I'll
rồi, kiếm
get
phòng
sugar.
ra. Kiếm nhá. Cô Phú say
I'll bring one with sugar. No, I'll bring a plate. Sugar. He doesn't want sugar.
đi thiếu phòng cơ mà.
One more sugar? Okay. Can you add sugar in there? Fire is okay now. Because I put water.
No fire.
No fire. This is okay. You don't want too much fire.
I need to build your own costume and talks about like highball.
What is our country?
That's the currency they have. I don't know. Highball.
What are the pictures?
And there's also like coins, or, like
Right.
coins that are
Right.
hard to get,
Right.
and it's only the high bucks that's really easy.
Wait,
So that's what it's called, the money. Yeah, look at this rock. Look at this. This is a crystal. Look at this. This is marble. Marble. This is marble. No, people were like in my age, like even in my age. I love making ones like this.
Michelle, how much brothers do you have?
2. What? I have an older brother.
Since when?
Let's
I always had an older
let's
brother.
try one first.
And
When we
how
do
much
more,
do you like Roblox?
because
Do you
they-
like Minecraft?
Oh, it's like
this one is
18
very
years old.
hot. If it is very hot, this won't come out.
Michelle, do
You
you
can do
like
big one.
Minecraft or Roblox?
When this
Roblox.
one get ready,
Roblox
you
over
can do
Minecraft
bigger
anyway.
one. Otherwise,
No,
too
but
hot. Otherwise, it
People,
won't
like,
come
can't
out.
do this.
And we do.
So that's really easy.
Yeah,
I don't get
that's
why
the
someone.
do you like playing Roblox with Rose?
Is it a prime piece or
It's
what?
like a pancake, yeah.
Okay.
Sort of.
Oh, shoot. That's awesome.
Stop.
Softer.
There you go. Sorry.
That's what we need.
It's like pancake. Is it good?
You know, in China, some people, some people realize that,
Sugar.
but not
Good?
strong.
Yeah. I put sugar. I put.
Nên là ở mang phải đắng. Có thể mà cầm này.
Stretch it. Stretch it. Stretch it. Can't see. Can't see. How old are you? Oh, the bath. What? How do you know that? No, I've said it. Okay. How come you are the same size?
Probably because you never added backwards.
Ah! 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 How much brothers do you have?
2. What? I have an older brother.
Now.
Do you want some sugar?
Yeah,
Give him some sugar, Michelle.
La 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 la. Just at the end of Get rid of the sugar.
So much sugar. Ah!
Try this. It's gonna get burnt.
There.
Yeah.
You're like, sugar making this. Yeah, I was. Now we have to take pictures.
നിങ്ങളൊക്കെ ദൂരെയാണോ കുറച്ച് പോണോ ദൂരെ
For some very, very simple genetic analysis done with identical and non-identical twins. So let's say I saw a patient in the clinic who has an identical twin. My patient, of course, the dice are slightly low against those kinds of trials because their own immune system is attacking itself in a horrible error.
I understand that the symptoms of lupus can be presented by different people and in different ways. So if you know what lupus is, how do you go about detecting and diagnosing it?
Well, lupus is a tough disease to spot sometimes because it's a bit of a chameleon. It can look like lots of other diseases, and that's part of the problem. So one of the issues is being able to recognize some of the patterns. And one of the classical patterns, for example, is a young woman who goes outside on a hot day, is exposed to a lot of sunlight, and will develop a rash, often on her face and often in the shape of a butterfly. That's one of the classic ways in which lupus can present. But it can also present with joint pains, which can mimic rheumatoid arthritis. So I've seen a number of patients treated as if they had rheumatoid arthritis all along, when in fact they had lupus. There are other ways in which you can present with kidney disease. Other patients will present with platelet problems. Now, the platelets are the cells in the blood which cause the blood to clot. So if the platelets are attacked in error, then this means that the patient will begin to bruise very easily, and even to bleed sometimes very easily. Now, these clinical features have to be aligned to a number of blood tests. It's the combination of the clinical features together with the blood test abnormalities that gives us the diagnosis of lupus.
Is that why it can take a long time for a diagnosis, and a clear one, to actually emerge?
Yes, because officially lupus can't be diagnosed until at least 4 of the criteria defined by the American College of Rheumatology have been met, and that may be some time. So you could, for example, have a light sensitivity for a number of years before the joint pains become obvious and the blood test abnormalities become obvious. And in fact, we know from some very interesting work done in American Army recruits that blood test abnormalities of lupus can be present in your blood for up to 10 years before the clinical features develop. So yes, there can be quite a long lag before you can confidently make the diagnosis.
That can mean a certain amount of discomfort, and I'm perhaps underplaying it when I say that, for people for quite some time before they get that clear diagnosis. From that point, what is the treatment phase, and what are the processes involved?
Well, you're right that there can be a time lag, and the time lag can be worrying both to the patient and also to the doctor, because they may be treating, quite frankly, the wrong disease in a way, and therefore they'll be frustrated because they can't understand why their treatment for this particular condition isn't working so well. So it can be very frustrating for both parties. Once the disease...
അപ്പം ഞാനൊരു കാര്യം ചെയ്യാം, ഇതിൻ്റെ ഒരു
self and non-self. And irony of ironies begins to attack the immune system itself, and this causes an awful lot of problems. Now, there are other examples of this where, for example, the immune system will attack the pancreas. This can give rise to diabetes, or it can attack the joints in the hands, the feet, etc., giving rise to rheumatoid arthritis. So lupus is an example of friendly fire, where the immune system is attacking itself in a horrible error.
I understand that the symptoms of lupus can...
Kidneys, invariably we have to use very more aggressive tools, steroids in larger doses, and suppressive drugs in often large amounts, to get control of the situation. And that, as I say, is where the problems often really start.
Is lupus the sort of condition that affects males and females equally? Does it affect different groups in society, the young and the old, for example?
It's a disease very much in women. Heart or in the kidneys, invariably we have to use rather more aggressive tools, steroids in larger doses, suppressive tissues, giving rise to so many of the problems.
It must be very difficult also for patients of lupus, because many of them don't look unwell. It's a subject I know there's been the subject of quite a lot of conversation in recent months.
Their friends and their family, enormously fatigued with a common feature of lupus. The joint pains may not necessarily translate to joint swelling.
Just beyond that is Indian Pondicherry, and the Muslim quarter is just to the west. When the French handed Pondicherry back to us in 1954, the town decided that some sort of commemoration was in order. My father, who was a clever businessman, came up with one. He ran a hotel and he got the idea to open a zoo in the local botanical gardens instead. As it also happened, my mother was a botanist in the gardens. They met, married, and a year later my brother Ravi was born. I came 2 years after that. Sounds magical. From
No, non è